Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the Jonestown Massacre and the events that occurred there in November of 1978 with Jim Jones and his followers. And Chris, we've already talked about, we talked about the Oneida community, which didn't end necessarily bad. It was controversial, but it didn't end really badly. And of course, we also talked about Waco. We've had an episode on the Waco tragedy in Waco, Texas. And of course, both Jonestown and Waco have a lot in common in that they end very tragically for their followers.
Yeah. And, Ray, it was interesting that basically you and I were not planning on talking about Jonestown. Kind of wasn't on our radar, but after the September 11th episodes that we did, we had a request from a listener, and that listener kind of wanted us to talk about Jonestown. And what I found interesting is that this listener, and we want to say thank you so much for the topic, Faith, very appreciative of that. But I think the correlation that she was telling me about is that, up until the 9/11 attacks, basically the tragedy in Jonestown is one of the largest number of American civilian casualties in a single non-natural event or something like that.
A single event, yeah.
And it comes about through, once again, religion, power, ego, greed. And just like Oneida, they wanted to do the right thing. They had the intent of trying to do, not utopia necessarily, but trying to bring about good. But the leader kind of went off the rails, and that just led to this, just devastating event.
Yeah, Jim Jones is you talk about, maybe it's starting off in a more positive direction and then just going off the rails. Jim Jones, he starts off, I think, at least on the surface, in a very commendable way. In 1954, he opened up a church in Indianapolis, Indiana, and one of his main messages was racial equality. You think about what was going on in 1954, and you think, here is a man who's opening a church which is deliberately preaching racial equality. And of course, many of his congregants are going to be African Americans. That's a positive thing. So he starts off with a very positive message, maybe moving in a positive direction. But things begin to change, just over 10 years later in 1956, when he starts worrying about a nuclear war. And he believes that there's going to be some sort of nuclear attack on the United States. So he convinces his followers to move to California before what he believed was going to be a nuclear attack that might happen on July 15, 1967. So in 1965, he moves his congregation, the so-called People's Temple, which was in Indianapolis, to California, I guess, to avoid the fallout of nuclear war.
Yeah, and one of the things that we continue to read about and to hear about when we think about survivors of this is that most of the people that were part of his church, and called the People's Temple, as you mentioned, is that they said we felt like a family more than a church. It was like this community. And for that time, as you mentioned, you have this diverse mix of racial backgrounds. You have diverse age groups. You have people who are being drawn. Here's the word that we're even hearing a lot about in today's society, this progressive ideals, these activist ideals, where people are wanting to change and they're wanting to see change. And Ray, Jim Jones and the church actually turned a lot of people's lives around, because he helped people get off of drugs. He brought them off of the streets. He took them away from crime. And so, this is, a lot of people say that Jonestown was a cult, and that these people were just blindly devoted to a man, and, they gave up everything that they had. But, if you do a deep dive into Jonestown, I think a lot of these people were not focused on the man, but they were focused on the mission, and they believed in the mission. And they also believed that it was him who was the only one that could actually get them there. So I think we have to be careful when talking about this movement, if you will, because that's what it was in their eyes. It later changes because Jim Jones basically allows some different things to come up. But I mean, Jim Jones also had I guess, an advisor, if you will. I thought it was interesting that he, he's a white guy who's working with a lot of African-American individuals, but he was very friendly with this guy whose name was Father Divine.
Yep.
And, he was a controversial Black evangelist during the time, but, he was part of the peace moment. And so it's pretty interesting because a lot of people saw Father Divine as a god. And I think maybe that's where Jim Jones started to kind of venture off down the wrong path, especially after, Father Divine passes away. And
because when Father Divine dies, Jones goes over and claims to be the reincarnation of Father Divine. And to say that didn't go well is an understatement. Father Divine's wife kicked him and his followers out of the organization that Father Divine was leading. So it didn't go well when he went over and claimed to be, sort of the reincarnation of Father Divine. But I think it does show you, despite the fact that on the surface things were going well, you talked about the fact that people looked at it more of as a family than a church. They had a mission, they had things they were doing. And Chris, I think it's important to bring out that, and you sort of touched on this, these weren't just a bunch of gullible people. These were people, different education levels, different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, different races. Many of them were African American, but there were other races involved in there as well. And even though Jim Jones was sort of the center of the community, he was sort of the focus of the community in some ways. The real attraction, according to some of the accounts I read, was the community there, that group of people. So I think maybe that was why, and this is just me opining here a little bit, but I think that's why maybe people didn't catch on that there was something going on with this Jones character, with their preacher, that despite he was charismatic and had this wonderful group of people around him, there was something wrong with him. And of course, this thing with the Father Divine maybe should have been a clue. But when you have all these people and you're busy and you're going and you're doing, maybe it didn't show up as the warning signal it should have been.
But go throughout history, and how many times have people followed a leader, truly believing in the cause because they were dynamic, they had a powerful personality, they had a way with words. And I mean, I think that these followers, first of all, saw him as a religious leader, right? I mean, they saw him, they thought he was the modern day Moses, and that he was going to lead the people out of of slavery and bondage to drugs and to crime and to all of these other things. And they thought they were going to the promised land. And it's not, and this is the way, as I was just mentioning, it's always after, when people start to say, oh my gosh, this guy had a dark side. He had a need to control people. He deceived people. He manipulated people. We saw that with Father Divine, the way he tried to take over that mission movement. And by the way, as you mentioned, when Mother Divine kicks him out, he does steal some of the people from the peace mission movement to kind of go with him. But you start to see how, what's that thing? I wish I would have known then what I know now.
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue, because then they start thinking, oh, wow, look at how angry he got when people betrayed him or when people abandoned him. But you got to say this about Jim Jones. He was obsessed with religion. It was all about religion for him. He really thought that the Bible and other things was leading him to this moment and to this mission. But he was also obsessed with death. And even from his early ages, he wanted to experiment with death. And there was, I think, a story or something. he killed a cat with a knife when he was a young kid. And, you start seeing these things that start to develop that shows he's really not who he said he was.
That's interesting because, you sometimes hear that serial killers and people like that start with small animals and household pets, and then they move up, I guess it is, to humans. So again, all these warning signs are there that something's wrong with Jim Jones. Now, eventually, the government in California begins to grow suspicious of some of the activity that's going on there at the People's Temple, and they start, I guess you could say, poking around a little bit. So Jones and a number of his followers decide that they're going to create an agricultural settlement, i.e. what we call Jonestown, in Guyana, down in East Venezuela. And so he packs up his community and this group of people, and he moves them down to Venezuela. And Chris, you got to talk about how persuasive someone had to have been to convince these people, okay, leave your homeland, leave your security, and let's go down to this jungle down in Venezuela and let's sort of form our own little society there. You got to wonder, how he was able to convince not everybody to go down there, but enough to go that he had a good group going with him.
Well, I think you just go back and look. As you mentioned, they started in Indianapolis, and then he thought about this nuclear war that was coming. He actually told them, he said, we got to get out of here before July 15th, 1967, because that nuclear war is going to happen. And so they believed him then, to move out of the way. And so I think that they just think this guy surely has our best interest. But I also have to wonder, how did you miss some of these signs? Because, as he's doing that, he is kind of like the Oneida community, right? He doesn't like romantic relationships. He doesn't want the individuals together because he thought it was a threat, and that they should be focusing on the work and not focusing on each other. And I think if you look now, I think what you start to see is that people were scared to talk about their feelings about Jones or anything else because they were afraid that their spouse or maybe their friend might turn them in or something, that they were the crazy ones.
Yeah, just like in Oneida and in so many other type of cult type of situations, the leader doesn't always practice what he preaches. And in this particular context, Jim Jones is actually arrested. I believe it was in a Los Angeles movie theater at one point in 1973 for lewd conduct. I didn't go into trying to explore what that referred to, but apparently he got arrested in a movie theater. He was addicted to various pharmaceuticals. He also engaged in sexual relationships with women in his community, and we're not going to stop there, also with a number of men in his community. So this is an example where he's telling everybody around him, this is what you should not be doing, but he himself is doing it, is engaging in the behavior. He's telling his followers, do not engage in that behavior. And one of his, a member of Jonestown who actually, left the community said, a guy called Tim Carter said that Jones hated romantic relationships in the group because he viewed those romantic relationships as a threat to the group, and also as a threat to the group's mission, that members should be focused on the work of the group and not on, I guess you could say, other things.
Yeah. And another ex-member also said that Jim Jones had said that every single one of the people were homosexuals except for him. He was the only heterosexual on the planet. And
he didn't act like it, though.
No, he doesn't act like it. But basically, he says that. And so he's having sexual relations with some of these individuals, as you mentioned. And then, to add to that, he really, I think it's that, Ray, that kind of leads to the tragedy that unfolds at Jonestown, because one of the ladies in his inner circle who was married to a guy that was in the temple was pregnant and had a baby. And Jim Jones said, that's mine.
He took the baby with him to Venezuela. And of course, the parents could not get the child back. And the child is going to be among those who die in November of 1978. So he not only manipulated people to get people to do what he wanted them to do, i.e. follow him from Indianapolis to California, following him from California to Venezuela, he manipulated people, but he also didn't practice what he preached, and he found weaknesses in people, and he took advantage of those weaknesses. One of them being possession of this family's child.
Yeah, not even possession of the child, but he was able to get the husband to actually sign an affidavit that said, I confirm that Jim Jones is the father of that son. And so, I mean, even though the guy didn't believe it, Jim Jones somehow was able to get the guy to sign off saying it was. And then when the lady leaves the church, I don't get this, but she, in fear or whatever it might be, but she left the son with Jim Jones, so that's how the son winds up in Guyana right there. And, you know, I think that child becomes a major player in this whole thing, because think about this. It's in the newspapers. People are talking about it. People in the temple are talking about it. You know, there's a lot of talk that's going on. So if Jones loses that one child, then what happens is they say, oh, he's not as strong as maybe he thinks he is.
Yeah.
And if he loses that one child, maybe other family members who are concerned that this is a cult, maybe they start trying to push back against Jones. And then Jones might see that there's a riot on his hands, that this community that he once built isn't all for him like he thought.
Yeah, you know, one thing that I learned when reading, you know, these testimonies from people who had survived Jonestown, there's one thing that Jim Jones did not like, and that was what he perceived to be his portrayal. You know, he did not like people turning on him or not doing what he asked them or commanded them to do. And Chris, this all brings us, I guess, to the main event of this horrible saga, and that is November of 1978. And it all, I think, sort of begins with a trip to Jonestown by a United States congressman by the name of Leo Ryan. And Ryan is, my understanding and my impression of him is that he was a very headstrong congressman, and he was going to go down there and he was going to find out what was really going on. Because, of course, there was a belief that he had, maybe others had as well, that there were people down there who were being Americans who were being held there in Jonestown against their will. And he wanted to go down there and find out what exactly was going on. So he goes down there, and of course, you know, he's talking to people, and some of the members of the community sort of confide in him, in Congressman Ryan, that they don't want to be there. They want to come home. And it's my understanding, Chris, tell me if you found this true, Jones may have found out about some of that. You know, he may have found out that some of these people were wanting to go home, and maybe Congressman Ryan was going to take some of them, which he tried to do, take some of them out of Jonestown.
Yeah, Jim Jones was going up against a maverick in Leo Ryan. Leo Ryan, yes, he's a congressman, but I mean, he was one tough dude, and he didn't mess around. I thought it was interesting just kind of doing some background on Leo Ryan. He might be a really good person to do a podcast on sometime, because he was unconventional. Somebody had said that one of the prisons in his state was like really, really bad off, and it was terrible. And so he actually had himself incarcerated in that prison so he could actually find out, is it true? Is it really, really bad? I mean, you know, for somebody to voluntarily go into a prison and to hang out there just to get the lay of the land, especially a congressman, I think that says a lot. But I think the other thing about Leo Ryan is he was pretty smart because he was from California, where the People's Temple had migrated to after Indianapolis, and he didn't go by himself, but
Right.
he took journalists with him. And that's the smartest thing you could do. Take the newspaper, take the Time Magazine people, take those people down there.
And there are video reels of this. You can go on YouTube and you can look at video reels of his time there in Jonestown, which would end up, Chris, being the last moments, last hours of his life, because when he goes to the airport, something really bad happens.
Yeah, and I think it's also important. Leo didn't just show up unexpected. I mean, he actually sent a letter to Jim Jones saying, hey, I'd like to come down. I'd like to see what you're doing. I recognize you got this agribusiness and some things are happening. So, he tried to do it the right way. It wasn't a sneak, surprise visit here. And Jones didn't really like it. And some of his followers probably didn't really like it. But I think Jones was in a bad spot now, right? Because if he tells the congressman, sorry, dude, you can't come, well, that's going to send red flags up to everybody. And so, Jones is now in a serious situation. He has to let the congressman come. And so the congressman comes, and I don't think Jim Jones was expecting the journalists to be there. I don't think he was expecting some of the relatives to be there. And that's where things turn south, as you say, because, what begins to happen is Jones says, oh my gosh, this is really bad. And if these guys get on the plane and they go back home, I've lost the kingdom. I've lost everything. And so Jim Jones tells the congressman and some relatives and even some defectors, he says goodbye. And says, I'm going to take some guys and they'll take you to the airport and have a safe trip back. And I mean, my gosh.
They get to the plane, but it's interesting. I was reading and I copied out a whole section of this particular lady. She did an interview, and but she talks about how when the day came for the Congressman Ryan to be there, she said it had been a very bad day. Congressman Ryan had come to investigate the compound and people were leaving with him. In other words, things had gone south. So as they're getting ready to get on the airplane at the airport, Chris, a truck drives up, gunmen get out of the truck and just start shooting anybody near that plane. And a number of people, Chris, are killed, including Congressman Ryan.
Yeah, and I think once again, it's kind of like Waco and David Koresh that we mentioned. Because you would be asking yourself, who on earth is going to shoot down congressmen and people trying to leave who came for a visit? I mean, they've done nothing wrong. So there are these followers who just believe 100% in Jim Jones and what he's doing, to the point they're willing to commit murder. You have those people who are so drawn to the man that no matter what he says, they'll do. And so, the congressman and 4 people are killed, and now Jones is in a really bad spot, and the members are, because that congressman's not coming home. There's journalists. There's other people that have been injured. This is going to get back. And not only is it going to get back to America, but, Jones is actually in Guyana, right? And so, he basically now has these 900 followers in Jonestown, and he's saying, hey, guys, we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to commit suicide, because if we don't commit suicide, then the Guyanese military is going to come and take your children. Yep. So here's your option. You either die with your child, or you let the military take away your child. But either way, you're going to lose your child. And he used the one thing, that one weapon that he knew he could get people to follow him on for one last time. And that was a child.
Yeah. And it was that kind of blackmail, emotional blackmail that he used. But also, Chris, he used, I don't know what the right phrase would be for it, but he used conditioning. Maybe that's the right word. People who were in the camp talk about loudspeakers all over the place, and Jones's recorded voice would come over those loudspeakers almost 24 hours a day. And you really weren't allowed to talk. You were supposed to be quiet and listen to what he says. So you have this brainwashing that's going on. You're constantly hearing his words. But every once in a while, he would call out very loudly on the speakers, white knight, get to the pavilion, run, your lives are in danger. And everyone would run to the pavilion, I guess the center there, and thinking, not knowing this was just, I guess, a drill of some sort, because he was telling them that in the United States, African Americans, and many of the people in Jonestown were African American, that African Americans were being put into concentration camps, and that there was literally genocide in the street, and they were coming to Guyana, and they were going to do the same thing to the people there in Guyana. So, he was conditioning his people through emotional blackmail, through manipulation, through, to respond in a certain way. And when they would get into the pavilion, there would be gunmen firing what was described as, fake bullets to make it sound like this was the real thing. This was the real moment. The moment had come, and there would be women coming out with cyanide-laced drink, and we'll talk about the drink here in a minute. And everybody drank it, but they didn't know, all right, was this going to be real or not? Of course, it wasn't real most of the time, except on November 18, 1978, when the drinks were laced with cyanide, and it was real.
Yeah, and I have to, there's a lot of people that will say that this was mass suicide because people lined up to take the poison drink. And I mean, as you mentioned, he had done test runs before where he had this cyanide laced punch, but he also had needles, as well. And there's evidence that people had been injected with needles and also, but, I don't see this as being a mass suicide. I can't go along with that because I really think that this was just murder. That's what it was, that you have a deranged individual who is such of a coward that he can't just go away on his own, but that in one last act of desperation, he has to be the ultimate victor, I guess, and take 900 and some people with him. Because as you mentioned, there's people who are armed with guns and things like that, and basically saying, you're not going to get out of here alive. And I mean, with the children and I mean, Ray, I go back and doing the research and going back to the old Time article from the journalists that were there and some of the newspaper articles. It was so hard to read those journals and to see those photographs. It just, there's no way that a group of followers, based on the scenes of those pictures, willingly went to their death for this man.
Yeah, they had been manipulated and conditioned to that point. But like you said, that particular day, November 18, 1978, nobody was getting out of that compound alive. Anybody who tried to run would be shot. People who resisted were held down and injected with the poison. Of course, the first group of people to have the poison ingested were the babies and the children. And of course, the parents weren't going to leave them. So this was a mass murder. I agree with you. This was not a mass suicide. This was a mass murder. Yes, there were probably those in the group who were willing to die for Jim Jones or whatever. But I'm sure for a lot of these people, they no longer saw themselves as having a choice. They had been manipulated into believing bad things were happening in the United States, and it would eventually come against them. They had been manipulated by these exercises in which they would have these drills go into the pavilion, and now they've got gunmen around them, and they've got people with these syringes and the Kool-Aid. And Chris, I know we often don't talk about episodes before we record an episode, but we did the other day talk about the Kool-Aid, because you'll oftentimes hear people say somebody drank the Kool-Aid. And what happened at Jonestown was not Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I remember, and I actually felt guilty about this, because I remember in times past somebody has used that as a joking reference, to don't drink the Kool-Aid in a joking. And I guess when I was researching this, I recognized that that's not something to laugh about. It's not something to even mention, because 900 and some people, children, lost their lives, and that it didn't just end in Guyana, that the former temple members, some who are still alive even today, that they still face trauma with this. It is still difficult. I was reading of some of these survivors from Jonestown and how their lives have been extremely difficult. They have wound up, some of them in jail, some of them committing suicide, having a hard time really just resuming their lives, not just being able to do that. And so I appreciate being able to go back and look at this event in history, because it's reminded me that every event in history, whether it's good, whether it's bad, it always has consequences. And there's always people who get hurt in the process. And that we have to look back at history and see that those were real people. It was a real event. People lost their lives. And we have to remember that to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And unfortunately, Waco, Branch Davidians, there are religious groups that are out there today, and not even religious groups, but we have just this society today is seeming to latch on to individual people, or maybe even individual groups. And it's you can't say it's a cult, I guess. I don't know what the right word would be, but it's scary seeing these groupings that are willing to do whatever it takes. And I mean, Ray, January 6th, the history will come back to January 6th and will define what that was. But it was an attack on democracy no matter what. And no matter what the purpose was, just as the purpose of some of those people going to Guyana for agribusiness, right? I mean, some of them went there thinking they were doing the right thing. And I'm sure that there are some people who gathered on a January 6th in Washington, D.C., thinking they were doing the right thing and never had any intention of it turning into what it turned into. Once again, another tragedy that will be remembered throughout the course of history. So I think we've just really got to look at those things in different lights, I guess, today.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions when you look at events like Waco, like Jonestown, or any other event like this. You have to ask questions, learn the lessons of history. Why were these people willing to follow this man the way they did? How damaged must this man have been? I mean, he was not. And by the way, before we wrap this up, we do want to talk about what happened to Jim Jones, because he did not drink the drink.
Right.
He either shot himself or had someone else shoot him.
Yeah.
So
he might have been a nurse or something, right?
Yeah. So he didn't go the way, and I don't know a lot about cyanide poisoning, but I cannot imagine, Chris, that's a pleasant way to die. Not saying being shot is a pleasant way to die, but cyanide poisoning is respiratory failure and all the stuff that would follow that. That would not have been an easy way to die. But he was able to manipulate these people and push these people into that corner to where they were willing, or put themselves in a position where either they were willing or they had no other choice than to follow him in death. And there are a lot of lessons that history like this teaches us that I think we need to be very wary of today. Because like you said, the internet and experts have been warning about this for years. The internet, whether you're talking about different forms of terrorism or extremism, the internet is a perfect recruiting tool. And, Jim Jones did not have the internet, but imagine how worse it could have been had he had a tool like the internet.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to go back and review this tragic event, and for us to be reminded that before 9/11, I mean, one of the worst mass casualties here in America, and all under the guise of religion and doing the right thing. So we always have to be observant and careful, researching who our leader is, researching what the plans of the group is all about, and just always being, I guess, vigilant about making sure that everything we do is
watching
is
for
honorable.
watching for those red flags.
Yeah.
Watching for any red flags. Chris, I've really enjoyed this episode. I hope our listeners have as well. Hey, like Chris said at the beginning of this episode, this was really a listener requested episode. If you have a topic you want us to address, please feel free to contact us. You can contact us at email. It's historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter. You can contact us through any of those platforms, and we'll be glad to consider any suggestions you may have. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.